The air in the Great Obsidian Hall didn't smell like oxygen or nitrogen. It smelled like ozone and ancient dying stars. Silas Vance, a man who had spent the last decade of his life digging through the radioactive dirt of frontier moons, felt entirely out of place in his pressed Union blues. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a xeno-geologist who preferred the company of rocks that didn't talk back. But here he was, standing in the heart of the Vora-Thul Empire, representing a humanity that was still considered the new kids on the Galactic block. His handler, a high-ranking synthetic named Kalen, leaned in close, its voice a low-frequency hum. "Silas, remember the protocol. The Vora-Thul do not value words. They value presence. Do not blink more than necessary, and for the sake of Earth's remaining colonies, do not stare at the High Guard. Their armor is made of collapsed star matter. It will literally sear your retinas if you look too long." Silas nodded, his throat bone dry. He looked around the chamber, which was large enough to house a small city. To his right, a swarm of sentient gaseous clouds from the Pillar Nebula drifted in translucent canisters, their internal lightning flashes signaling what Silas could only assume was intense nervousness. Humanity was small here. We were a footnote in a library that stretched back billions of years. But the atmosphere changed the moment the great doors, slabs of dark matter that seemed to drink the light, began to grind open. "Hold on. Before we get into the real stuff, I want to know, what are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments." A silence so heavy it felt physical crashed down upon the assembly. This was the moment the entire sector had whispered about in hushed, terrified tones for centuries. The Empress of the Vora-Thul, a being said to have witnessed the birth of the current suns, was entering the room. As she floated toward the central dais, Silas felt his breath hitch. She wasn't a monster. She didn't have tentacles or 1,000 eyes. She was draped in shimmering liquid light robes that flowed like a waterfall of diamonds. Her skin was the color of a twilight sky, and her stature was grace personified. "She was the most magnificent queen I've ever seen," Silas whispered, the words escaping his lips before his brain could filter them. He thought he was safe behind the roar of the hall's atmospheric processors. He was wrong. The Empress stopped dead in her tracks. The liquid light of her gown suddenly pulsed a deep, warning violet. The entire room held its collective breath, and the High Guard shifted their spears, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. Silas felt Kalen's hand grip his arm with enough force to dent steel. Then, with a deliberate, haunting slowness, the Empress began to turn. She didn't just move her head. She pivoted her entire being toward the tiny, insignificant human standing in the third row of the diplomatic circle. Her eyes weren't eyes at all. They were twin galaxies swirling with an intelligence that felt like it was peeling back the layers of Silas's very soul. As her gaze locked onto his, the temperature in the room dropped 40 degrees. Silas realized in that heartbeat that she hadn't just heard him, she had felt the vibration of his soul. And she looked hungry. The weight of the Empress's gaze was more than just a look. It felt like a physical pressure crushing Silas against the cold obsidian floor. Every xenobiological textbook he'd ever memorized flashed through his mind, and every single one of them shouted the same warning. In the presence of a Vora-Thul apex, do not show your teeth, do not raise your hands, and for the love of Earth, do not look them in the eye. Silas had failed the most important rule in the first 10 seconds of the summit. Around him, the other galactic delegates began to subtly back away. The crystalline entities from the Helix Nebula dimmed their internal lights, effectively playing dead. The sentient gas clouds retreated into their canisters, their lightning flickers turning a muted, terrified gray. Even Kalen, a synthetic built to withstand the vacuum of space, had gone completely rigid, its internal cooling fans whirring at a frantic, audible pitch. "Silas," Kalen's voice crackled through the neural link. "If you have a god, now would be the time to speak to them. Her neural resonance is spiking. She's scanning your biometrics. She's reading your heart rate, your adrenaline, the very chemistry of your fear." The Empress didn't speak with a voice. Instead, a ripple of psychic energy washed over the hall, sounding like 1,000 silver bells ringing at once inside Silas's skull. A human, the thought echoed, cold and sharp as a glacier. A creature of carbon and fleeting dreams. You dare to speak of magnificence in the house of the eternal? Silas felt his knees tremble. He was a geologist, a man who measured time in eons and pressure in gigapascals. But the pressure in this room was immeasurable. The Empress took a single step toward him. The liquid light fabric of her gown hissed as it brushed against the floor, a sound like a predator moving through dry grass. The High Guard, beings of living shadow encased in star matter armor, leveled their spears. The tips glowed with a sickly green chronal energy, the kind of power that didn't just kill you, it erased your entire timeline from existence. One wrong move from Silas and humanity wouldn't just lose an ambassador. Earth's entire history might simply vanish as if it never happened. But then Silas noticed something. Amidst the terrifying display of power, he saw a flicker in the Empress's swirling galactic eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous. Curiosity. She had ruled for 10,000 years, and in all that time, no one had ever dared to whisper a personal observation in her presence. Everyone treated her as a force of nature, a god, or a catastrophe. Silas had treated her as a person. She stopped just 3 feet from him. Up close, the scent of ozone was overwhelming, and the heat radiating from her form felt like standing near a kiln. She leaned in, her face, a masterpiece of celestial geometry, tilting slightly. "You called me magnificent." The voice vibrated in his mind again, this time with a hint of something that felt like a dark, melodic laugh. "Tell me, little stonebreaker from the dirt world, do you know what happens to things that are too magnificent for this universe?" Silas opened his mouth to respond, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew he should apologize. He knew he should beg for mercy. But as he looked into those swirling galaxies, he saw a reflection of the very stars he had spent his life studying. "They usually collapse under their own weight," Silas whispered, his voice cracking but steady. "And then they become a singularity. Something nothing can escape." The Empress froze. The violet light of her robe suddenly flared into a blinding, incandescent white. The High Guard took a step forward, their spears humming with the sound of a universe ending. Silas closed his eyes, waiting for the erasure. But instead of the cold sting of death, he felt a hand, surprisingly warm and very much solid, touch his chin. He opened his eyes to see the Empress smiling, a sight that was more terrifying than her wrath. "Exactly," she projected, and the floor beneath Silas began to vibrate. "And you, Silas Vance, have just wandered into the event horizon." The touch of the Empress felt like holding a live wire. It wasn't just warmth. It was the hum of 1 billion years of evolution pressing against Silas's skin. Every hair on his arm stood up as a static charge rippled through the Great Obsidian Hall. The silence that followed his remark was so absolute that he could hear the rhythmic clicking of Kalen's internal processors trying to calculate the probability of their survival. The math, he was sure, wasn't looking good for Earth. The Empress leaned in even closer, her face inches from his. Up close, her skin wasn't skin at all. It was a complex lattice of shifting light, like the surface of a star captured under glass. "A singularity," she repeated within his mind, the psychic projection now carrying the weight of a mountain. "You compare your Empress to a void that consumes light? You compare the Vora-Thul legacy to a cosmic grave?" Silas felt the High Guard's spears hum louder, the green chronal energy beginning to arc toward him like hungry snakes. He knew that one word, one slip of the tongue, would result in him being unmade. Not just killed, but deleted from the tapestry of time. Yet, as a geologist, he knew that the most beautiful things in the universe were often the most destructive. "I compare you to the only thing in the universe that cannot be ignored," Silas said, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate strength. "A singularity is the ultimate truth of physics. It is where the rules break. It is where everything begins and ends. If that's a grave, then it's the most beautiful one in existence." The Empress's galactic eyes flared. For a moment, the swirling nebulae within her pupils spun at a dizzying speed. Then, the pressure vanished. The suffocating weight on Silas's chest lifted so suddenly he nearly stumbled into her. The violet warning light of her robes faded, replaced by a soft, rhythmic pulsing of deep sapphire blue. She pulled her hand away, but she didn't look away. Instead, she turned her head toward the rest of the silent, terrified assembly. The humans, she projected, her voice now echoing like a grand cathedral organ. They are small, they are fragile, they live for a heartbeat and then they are dust. And yet they look at the end of all things and see beauty, a murmur, a literal vibration of sound and energy, rippled through the hall. The crystalline entities began to glow with a cautious amber light. Kalen's grip on Silas's arm loosened, though the synthetic was still emitting a low-level warning chime. The Empress began to pace around Silas, her liquid light gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Other races come to us with tribute, she continued, her thoughts stabbing into the minds of everyone present. The Helix Nebula brings us refined isotopes. The Pillar Nebula brings us star maps. But this human, this Silas Vance, he brings us something we have not felt in 10,000 cycles. She stopped behind him, and Silas felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't see her, but he could feel the immense power radiating from her form. It was like standing at the edge of a volcano. He brings us a mirror, she whispered into his mind, and I find I quite like the reflection. She moved back to the front of the hall, ascending the dais with a grace that made gravity seem like a suggestion rather than a law. But as she reached the top, she didn't sit. She turned back to the high guard and made a sharp clicking sound with her fingers. The guard instantly deactivated their spears, the green light vanishing into the obsidian floor. But the relief Silas felt was short-lived. The Empress raised her hand, pointing directly at him. "The summit is postponed," she declared. "The Earth representative will stay. He will be my guest in the Celestial Gardens. We have much to discuss regarding singularities." Kalen's neural link exploded with frantic messages from Earth Command, but Silas couldn't hear them. All he could see was the Empress's faint, enigmatic smile. He had survived the encounter, but he realized with a sinking heart that he hadn't escaped. He had just been pulled deeper into the gravity well, and as the Empress turned to lead him into the private sanctum of the palace, a door no human had ever stepped through, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Her eyes were no longer swirling with galaxies. They were focused, sharp, and terrifyingly human. "Tell me, Silas," she projected, "do humans always flirt with death, or am I a special case?" The private sanctum of the Vora-Thul wasn't a room. It was a pocket dimension that shouldn't have existed. Silas stepped through the threshold and felt his equilibrium shatter. Above him there was no ceiling, only the raw, naked expanse of the Andromeda Galaxy, swirling so close he felt he could reach out and stir the stars like sugar in coffee. The ground beneath his boots was translucent, revealing a sprawling, bioluminescent forest of crystalline trees that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. The Empress stood at the edge of a floating balcony, her liquid light robes now a soft, tranquil gold. She didn't look like a god here. She looked like a prisoner of her own perfection. "You are trembling, Silas Vance," she projected, her mental voice losing its thunderous reverb and becoming something intimate, almost a whisper against the back of his mind. "Is it the cold of the vacuum, or the realization of where you stand?" Silas swallowed hard, trying to ignore the fact that there was nothing but a shimmering energy field between him and a 3,000 light-year drop. "In my line of work, ma'am, we're taught that the most beautiful views are usually the most lethal. I'm just trying to figure out which one this is." The Empress turned, and for the first time Silas noticed a thin silver vein running down her neck, a mark of age, or perhaps a scar from a war fought before humanity had even discovered fire. "You are a geologist," she thought, her eyes tracking the movement of a distant nebula. "You study the slow, grinding patience of worlds. My people, we are not patient. We are the flash of the supernova. We burned through our evolution in a cosmic blink, and now we simply endure." She walked toward him, the gravity of the room shifting with her movement. Silas felt himself being pulled toward her, not by physics, but by a strange, magnetic charisma. The other races fear us, she continued. They bring us tithes of ore and energy because they think it buys them another century of existence. But you whispered a compliment to a being that could erase your species with a thought. Why? Silas took a breath, the air tasting of ancient cedar and ozone. Because on Earth we have a saying, a cat may look at a king. It means that no matter how high someone sits, they're still part of the same universe. You might be an empress of 1 billion stars, but you're still made of the same heavy elements I dig out of the ground. We're cousins, in a way. Stardust and shadow. The Empress stopped inches from him. The golden light of her robes flared into a brilliant, curious orange. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the patch on his shoulder. The blue marble of Earth. Cousins, she echoed, the word tasting of ancient sorrow. A bold claim for a creature that lives less than a century. Do you know how many civilizations I have seen rise, scream into the void, and vanish into silence? I know, Silas said softly. But maybe that's why we're louder. We don't have 10,000 years to be polite. We have to say what we feel now, or we never get to say it at all. Suddenly the floor beneath them shuddered. A deep, subterranean groan vibrated through the crystalline trees below. The sky above, the raw view of Andromeda, began to flicker, the stars stuttering like a dying candle. The Empress's expression shifted from curiosity to a cold, sharpened steel. The resonance, she projected, her voice suddenly sharp enough to draw blood. They are early. Silas looked up as a massive, jagged tear appeared in the beautiful sky. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a breach. Something was clawing its way into the Empress's private dimension, something that didn't emit light but swallowed it. Dark, oily tendrils began to pour through the crack, and the temperature in the room plummeted toward absolute zero. The Empress didn't flinch. She stepped in front of Silas, her robes turning a violent, protective crimson. "Stay behind me, little stonebreaker," she commanded. "The void has come to collect its debt." But as the first of the dark entities solidified into a shape that defied every law of biology Silas knew, he realized the Empress wasn't just protecting him. She was shielding her own light from a hunger that had been hunting her for eons. The darkness didn't just fill the room, it ate the very concept of distance. Silas felt his lungs seize as the temperature hit a point where air felt like liquid nitrogen. The entities pouring through the rift were nightmares of geometry, shifting, oily shapes that looked like shattered glass made of midnight. They were the resonance, a cosmic echo of the void that existed before the Big Bang, and they were here for the light the Vora-Thul had hoarded for eons. The Empress raised both hands, and for a second Silas thought she was going to explode. Her liquid light robes didn't just glow, they ignited. A pillar of pure, white radiance erupted from her form, pushing back the oily tendrils. The sound was deafening, a choir of 1,000,000 voices screaming in a language of pure mathematics. "They have followed the scent of your words, Silas Vance." The Empress's voice boomed in his mind, strained and heavy with effort. "The resonance feeds on ripples in the causality stream. Your magnificence, your human observation. It created a spike in the local reality. You poked the veil, and now the veil is poking back." Silas scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the translucent floor. "You're saying I caused this? By talking?" "By noticing," she corrected, her light flickering as a massive dark limb lashed out, striking her protective field with the force of a falling moon. "Observation defines reality. For a moment, you made me more than a law of nature. You made me a person, and persons can be killed." The shield around them groaned. Silas looked at the Empress and saw for the first time a bead of glowing silvery sweat on her brow. She was losing. The Vora-Thul were masters of the physical universe, but these things were from the before. They didn't play by the rules of matter or energy. They were the ultimate nothing, and they were winning. One of the dark limbs bypassed the light shield, snaking toward the Empress's throat. Silas didn't think. He didn't have time to calculate the odds or consult Kalen. He reached into his gear belt and pulled out his heavy-duty geological pulse drill. It was a tool meant for breaking apart tectonic plates powered by a small, volatile isotope core. "Hey! Over here, you inkblot bastards!" Silas yelled, his voice cracking. He slammed the drill into overdrive and jammed the vibrating tip directly into the oily limb. The effect was instantaneous. The drill didn't cut the shadow. It vibrated the very space the shadow occupied. A high-pitched, glass-breaking shriek filled the air as the dark entity recoiled, its form blurring and destabilizing. The Empress gasped, the sudden break in the pressure allowing her to redouble her light, blasting a wave of heat that vaporized the nearest shadows. She turned to Silas, her eyes wide with a shock that bordered on horror. You attacked a void revenant with a mining tool?" "It's a high-frequency resonator," Silas panted, the drill's core glowing a dangerous, angry red in his hands. "Everything has a frequency, even the dark. You just have to find the right note to make it shatter." The Empress started to say something, perhaps a warning or a word of thanks, but she was cut off by a sound that made the previous screams seem like lullabies. The rift in the sky didn't just grow, it shattered. A massive, hooded silhouette, larger than the palace itself, began to pull itself through. It was the heart of the resonance. The Empress's robes turned a grim, final shade of charcoal gray. "The great silence," she whispered into Silas's soul. "It is over. There is no frequency for the end of all things." But as the gargantuan shadow reached down to swallow the little pocket dimension hole, Silas noticed something on his drill's display. The resonance wasn't just void. It was an inverse reflection. It was a mirror, just like the Empress had said. "Maybe not for the end," Silas muttered, looking at the Empress. "But what about a feedback loop?" The great silence loomed over them, a colossal shadow that didn't just block the stars, it erased the very memory of light. Silas felt his skin begin to crawl, his molecular structure vibrating as the entity's presence began to unravel the laws of physics in the room. Beside him, the Empress looked diminished, her liquid light robes flickering like a dying candle in a hurricane. For a being that had lived 10,000 years, this was the ultimate horror. A predator that didn't want her power, but her silence. "Silas." The Empress's voice was a fractured glass chime in his mind. "My light is finite. Its hunger is not. Go to the gateway. Perhaps if I detonate my core, the blast will seal the rift long enough for your kind to flee the sector." "And what happens to you?" Silas shouted over the roar of collapsing reality. "I become the singularity you spoke of," she projected, a hauntingly beautiful sadness washing over him. "A beautiful grave. Now go." "Not a chance," Silas spat, his fingers flying over the geological drill's interface. "You said I created a ripple because I noticed you. You said observation defines reality. Well, if that thing is a mirror of our universe's echoes, then it's observing us right back. It's feeding on the truth of our fear." He ripped the safety casing off the drill's isotope core. The small cylinder of protoplasmic lead glowed with a sickening neon blue intensity. Kalen's voice suddenly screamed through his neural link, a panicked burst of binary. "Silas, the radiation levels are terminal. You are breaching Union safety protocols by 3,000%. "Shut up, Kalen, I'm doing geology," Silas roared. He looked at the Empress, whose eyes were wide with a mix of awe and terror. "Your Majesty, I need you to do something that goes against every instinct you have. I need you to stop fighting it. I need you to shine, but not at it. Shine into the drill." The Empress hesitated, her galactic eyes searching his. "You want me to focus the essence of the Vora-Thul into a primitive mining tool? It's a resonator, remember?" Silas grinned, though his teeth were beginning to ache from the radiation. "If it wants to hear the music of the void, let's give it a remix. We're going to create a feedback loop. Your light, my frequency, and its own hunger. We're going to turn the mirror back on itself." The Empress didn't ask for a mathematical proof. She saw the raw, stubborn defiance in the human's eyes, the HFY spark that made her species seem stagnant by comparison. She reached out, her glowing hands closing over Silas's on the drill's handle. The world turned white. The Empress poured every eon of her stolen starlight, every memory of a dying sun, and every ounce of her magnificence into the drill's core. Silas held on as the device began to scream, the metal turning translucent, then molten. The drill didn't just vibrate, it began to tear the local fabric of space-time into a high-frequency harmony. The great silence reached down, its oily limbs wrapping around them, but the moment it touched the drill's output, the music hit it. The shadow didn't just recoil, it began to shatter like frozen glass. The feedback was instantaneous. Every bit of nothingness the entity tried to project was caught, amplified by the Empress's light, and blasted back into its own throat. The rift began to pulse with a violent, rhythmic strobe. The entity's hooded form distorted, stretching and thinning as it was sucked back into its own vacuum. It was a cosmic tug-of-war, and Silas Vance, a man who dug in the dirt, was holding the rope. "Almost there," Silas gasped, his vision blurring. The heat was melting his gloves to the drill. Then, with a sound like 1,000 universes sighing at once, the great silence imploded. The rift snapped shut, the oily tendrils evaporating into harmless sparkles of static. The pressure vanished. The stars of Andromeda returned to their rightful places, steady and bright. Silas collapsed to his knees, the spent, blackened drill clattering to the floor. His hands were burned, his lungs were burning, and his heart felt like it had run a marathon through a black hole. Silence returned to the sanctum, but this time it was a peaceful one. He looked up. The Empress was standing over him. Her robes were gone, replaced by a simple glowing skin that looked remarkably human in shape. She looked exhausted, her galactic eyes dimmed to a soft, twilight purple. She looked at Silas, then at the charred tool on the floor, and then back at him. "You," she projected, and for the first time her voice didn't sound like a god. It sounded like a woman who had just seen a miracle. "You tiny, ridiculous, impossible creature." She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his burned palm. Silas tried to find a witty remark, a geologist's pun, or a diplomatic save. But as she leaned in, her face inches from his, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't curiosity anymore. It was something that made the magnificence from before seem like a cheap trick. But before she could speak, the great obsidian doors at the far end of the sanctum burst open. The High Guard, Kalen, and a dozen panicked diplomats charged in, weapons drawn. "Silas!" Kalen's voice boomed. "The Union fleet is on high alert. We detected a Class 5 reality collapse. What happened? Where is the Empress?" Silas looked at the woman beside him. She stood up slowly, her robes reforming in a flash of brilliant, intimidating violet. The human softness vanished, replaced by the mask of the eternal. But as she turned to face the crowd, she caught Silas's eye one last time. The Empress stood tall, her presence expanding until it filled every corner of the sanctum, once again becoming the terrifying legend that kept the stars in alignment. The High Guard froze, their star matter spears dipping in a synchronized salute. Kalen skidded to a halt, its optical sensors clicking frantically as it tried to reconcile the readings of a reality collapse with the sight of a xeno-geologist sitting on the floor, covered in soot and smelling of burnt rubber. "Peace," the Empress commanded, her mental voice a shockwave that silenced the room. "The breach has been sealed. The void has been fed its own silence. And the union of Earth has proven itself to be more than a footnote in our history." She looked down at Silas, her expression unreadable to anyone but him. To the rest of the galaxy, she was a cold, immortal sun. To Silas, she was the person who had just shared a feedback loop with the end of time. "Silas Vance," she projected for all to hear, "the Vora-Thul do not offer thanks. We offer recognition. From this cycle forward, the species known as human shall walk among us not as subjects, but as witnesses of the singularity." The room erupted in a stunned, silent vibration of energy. The crystalline delegates began to flicker in shades of deep respect. Kalen's internal fans finally slowed down. "Witnesses? The synthetic whispered through the neural link. Silas, do you have any idea what that means? You've just jumped humanity ahead 5,000 years in diplomatic status. Silas didn't care about the status. He just wanted a very long nap and some medical-grade ointment for his hands. He climbed to his feet, leaning heavily on Kalen's metallic arm. As the High Guard began to escort the diplomats away to finalize the new treaties, Silas felt a final, delicate tug on his mind. The gardens are always open to those who know how to listen for the music, Silas. The Empress whispered, a private message that didn't reach anyone else. And don't worry about the drill. I'll have my artisans craft you one out of a neutron star. It should hold the frequency a bit better. She turned, her liquid light gown flowing like a river of gold, and disappeared into the depths of her palace. Silas watched her go, realizing that the universe had just become a lot smaller and a lot more dangerous. Because now, the most powerful being in the galaxy wasn't just watching humanity. She was waiting for us to catch up. As Silas walked back toward the shuttle, he looked out the window at the swirling stars of Andromeda. They didn't look like distant, cold gas balls anymore. They looked like possibilities. Humanity might be small and our lives might be a cosmic blink, but as it turns out, even a blink can blind a god if you time it right. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of the Vora-Thul Empire, make sure to hit that like button and share this story with your fellow star travelers. It really helps the channel grow and lets us bring more of these epic tales to life. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to join us here at HFY Scape for your daily dose of human defiance and galactic wonder. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and your hand on the drill. The universe is a big place, but it's nothing we can't handle.